I just thought it would be helpful relative to the last lecture just to have a breakdown of the Tudor line and how that leads into the Stuart line, because you had Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon and Bloody Mary, who becomes queen. His marriage to Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, their daughter, but then she dies without an heir, bringing in the Stuart line. James I and Charles I both tried to rule by divine right, both tried to limit the powers of Parliament. That leads to Charles I getting beheaded, leads us into civil war, and which is won by Parliament. You have the Commonwealth period in the Interregnum, but where Oliver Cromwell becomes a general dictator, a military dictator. Cromwell's son is inadequate, so you restore the monarchy. You get Charles I's son, Charles II, to sit on the throne. Same, same different day. And Charles II and James II rule as their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had. They butt heads with Parliament. We have another civil war in which Parliament reaches out to James's first, among James's first children with his first wife, Mary, who is married William of Orange over in the Netherlands, and they invade England at the request of Parliament, and you have the Glorious Revolution. They accept the Bill of Rights. Does that all make sense? Mm-hmm. Just a visual that might help with the confusing dynastic nature of that last lecture. But let us not delay any farther our discussion of what are sometimes called the gunpowder empires. Three great Muslim empires stretching from the Ganges River in India all the way through Persia, the Middle East, and Turkey into southeastern Europe, up the Nile River and across the Mediterranean coast of North Africa, into the Muslim holy lands of Mecca and Medina. Three great Muslim empires that rule these three separate areas here. We'll talk about the Mughals in India, the Safavid Empire in Persia, or what's now Iran. And mostly, though, today we will talk about the Ottoman Empire. This largely Arab Muslim empire, but ruled over by the invading outsiders, the Ottoman Turks, who become this great existential threat to southeastern Europe, like I think I alluded to a couple of times in the previous lecture. I've also talked in here before about the Reconquista. Fernando and Isabella, Castile and Aragon, who come together to form the Kingdom of Spain. And of course, in 1492, they fund the first voyage of Christopher Columbus, but also complete the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal sit. Meaning the reconquest by Christian rulers of the continent by driving out the very last of the Muslim rulers. The last prince of the Nasrid dynasty is defeated and removed from the Alhambra palace and castle outside of Granada in southern Spain in 1492. But even as Spain is completing the reconquest in the west, a new Islamic empire has emerged to the east and is at that very moment expanding into southeastern Europe. And that is the Ottoman Empire. But what are the origins of the Ottoman Empire? Well, we would have to trace all the way back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The messenger and the founder of Islam. When the Prophet and his followers take control of Medina and eventually come back and take control of Mecca, the holiest cities in what would become Islam, take control of the holy site in Mecca, the Kaaba. They began building an army to spread their faith all throughout the Middle East, which even in the time of the founder, the messenger, Muhammad, they do. Muhammad was a deeply spiritual man who at one point claims to have gone off to have some time of meditation and to have come upon him an angel who delivers to him the word of God, which he then transmits to his followers. Muhammad does not claim to be divine. He doesn't claim, like Christ, to be the Messiah or the Son of God. He is just the messenger. But this is very much the God of that same tradition. We call it the Abrahamic tradition. Whether you are Muslim, a follower of this faith that Muhammad is going to build, whether you are a Christian or whether you are Jewish, you are part of the Abrahamic tradition. The three great religions of the Abrahamic religion are all monotheistic. And you can call him Yahweh, you can call him God, or you can call him Allah. But it's the same God. And you could pick apart what I just said, of course. But more or less, bear with me, it's one God and it's the same God. Two, these religions share fundamental texts, sacred texts. If you look at the 5 books, the Pentateuch, or the Torah in the Jewish religion, you look at the Old Testament in Christianity, and you look at certain parts of the Quran, the holy book of Islam, it's the same text. It's the same story. And in Islam, they consider people like Jesus to have been prophets. But he's just not, if you're a follower of Islam, he's just not the last prophet. And if he thought he was the Messiah, he was wrong about that. Now, again, Muhammad is not claiming to be the Messiah. He's claiming to be the last and final messenger of God, giving you the word of God. It's written down in the Quran, and that becomes the holy, holy text of the Muslim faith, the Quran. But a part of spreading Islam from the very beginning was spreading the state. Like they considered themselves warriors of the faith, to constantly be spreading the faith through expanding the state, and that means through warfare. And so pretty quickly, after Muhammad's death, despite some squabbles about who should be in charge as the caliph, the defender of the faith, pretty quickly an Arab Muslim empire begins to take shape. So Islam is these people's religion. They are Arab ethnically speaking, but since they are followers of Islam, they are Muslim. The first great Arab Muslim empire to take shape in the Middle East is the Umayyad dynasty, or the Umayyad Caliphate. Followed by the Abbasid Caliphate. And between these two caliphates, you could trace the glory of the Arab Muslim world all the way across North Africa, what they would have called the Islamic Maghreb, the West. They conquer and convert the Berber peoples of North Africa. They conquer Egypt, all of the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, much of what's today Iraq, and into what's today Iran. And as you know, of course, at one point they do indeed go across the Strait of Gibraltar and begin conquering parts of the Iberian Peninsula, right? So all the way up to the mid-1200s, you have these great flourishing Arab Muslim empires while Europe is languishing, remember, in its dark ages. A lot of classical Western learning is kept alive in libraries in places like Baghdad and Alexandria in Iraq and Egypt. And when you have that the Renaissance and this burst of humanism and this search for classical text, A lot of times that means going to the Arab Muslim world and going to libraries in the Arab Muslim world in places like Baghdad to seek out those texts. So in other words, it was the Arab Muslim world that kept classical Western learning alive while Europe is mired in those dark ages. And they also, interestingly, introduced things like oranges, cotton, sugarcane to Europe through either their connections in the southeast, which are not quite as robust yet, and so probably mostly through Al-Andalus, that province on the Iberian Peninsula, the Muslim province Al-Andalus, from where we get the name of the Spanish state of Andalusia. What happened in the 1200s? Mongols. In the 1200s, these horseback riding, the masters of horseback archery, in fact, and master strategists of horseback warfare, the Mongols, semi-nomadic peoples from the North Central Asian steppe region, the high, flat, dry, arid plateau region of North Central Asia, they end up not only conquering the longtime target of such peoples from Central Asia, China, the big prize. They then turn their attentions south and west, and they conquer all of Central Asia. They conquer parts of Russia. They conquer a good portion of the Middle East, and they bring about the end of the continuous run of the Abbasid Caliphate. Two, these are not people who are in the interest of saying, well, we have now gained control of great cities like Baghdad with these nice libraries. They destroy them. They pillage, they destroy these areas. There's oftentimes more or less mass murder associated with Mongol conquest. It's a pretty ugly time. They do then split their empire up among the grandsons of Genghis Khan was the head of the Mongols when they begun their conquest, and his son Kublai Khan becomes the man who somewhat takes his place, and when he dies, the empire is split up among other sons and grandsons to be ruled over as different khanates. And that doesn't last long, just suffice it to say. And when Mongol rule collapses in Turkey and in the Middle East, you have a vacuum. Vacuum for another people to come in and step into that vacuum and take and consolidate power. And maybe to build a new great Muslim dynasty in this region. The people who do this are also a people, a horseback riding, semi-nomadic, warlike people from the Central Asian steppe who are Turkish or Turkic in their origins, not Arab. They're followers of a man named Osman Bey, hence we call them the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. Will come into this region of Turkey. Here, what we today call Turkey would have been called Anatolia back then, Asia Minor. And they begin to take areas and consolidate control and to establish a state. Here's where they differ from the Mongols. Well, one, they're much better at state building and maintaining a state and building and running and staffing a bureaucracy, as it turns out. But they are devout Muslims. They consider themselves in these consolidations and state building to be just like the followers of Muhammad who built the early empires. So they consider themselves Ghazis. G-H-A-Z-I-S, Ghazis. Warriors of the faith. And they consider their leaders to be the new caliphs or defenders of the faith. You can see that. So they begin consolidating their control of the Anatolian Peninsula or Turkey, eventually bringing back into their control, or bringing into their control for the first time, but bringing back into what it's going to become clear is going to be a new Muslim empire in the Middle East and Turkey, the lands of what we call the Levant, where Syria is and Palestine and where Lebanon is today. And eventually, the Tigris and Euphrates River of Iraq. Eventually, they will extend into Egypt as well. But pretty quickly, Ottoman armies are moving up and into southeastern Europe. And they're in territories in Greece and moving up into Macedonia and moving up towards Serbia, but they had to bypass something. What do they have to bypass? One of the most heavily fortified cities on the planet. And maybe we missed something here. These realms here, Anatolia, southeastern Europe, all of this, all that used to be held by the Byzantine Empire. Well, the Byzantine Empire is a shadow of itself at this point. I think it's often described, if you're talking about this period, as the dying but not yet dead Byzantine Empire. It is eventually reduced to basically just the capital city of Constantinople and maybe a few surrounding lands. I mean, that's not nothing. Again, it's one of the most heavily fortified cities on earth. Surrounded on water by three sides, 30-foot thick walls, multiple layers of walls. But if all you got's the city, and they just watch over the years and months as the Ottomans take control of everything around Constantinople, to the point where they have to watch in horror as this man, the Sultan Mehmet II, builds a fortified castle right across the strait from where Constantinople is, so that he can control the strait and fire upon any Byzantine ships that are trying to get in and out of the strait. And so you can just imagine going to bed every night and knowing that one day they're going to try to attack this city. And indeed, it had become the great quest of the Sultan Mehmet, who's, by the way, when I say he's taken the title of Sultan, leaders of these Muslim empires were always caliphs or defenders of the faith. It was always at once a political and religious position. When we get to the Ottomans, we're talking about you're a sultan too. You're the leader of the army on the battlefield. And that's how you prove your greatness. And Mehmet had gotten to the point where the Ottomans had taken so much land here, and they had taken important islands out in the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. They had taken land well up into southeastern Europe. It was time to take Constantinople. And he has his people he commissions the building of the greatest cannons that the world had ever seen. Massive cannons specifically designed to breach the walls of the city of Constantinople. One of the other genius things they did is there was a barrier chain. Do I have? No. My guy's going to roast me, and I don't care. I don't. It's not important to me. You know what it is? Google Earth is important to me. I want everyone to know that. Notice that it ain't Constantinople anymore. To the victor go the spoils. So, here is where the fortifications would be. You see it's surrounded by water on 3 sides. And you could string like a barrier chain here, so like Ottoman ships couldn't get in here and like fire on the backside of the city. But they have to sit again and watch in horror as they realize that the Ottoman army and navy have come together and realize they could take gigantic boards, like greased up boards, and have large numbers of men with chains, ropes, pull the ships over the greased boards around the barrier chain and into the strait on the other side of the barrier chain. And it's like, well, what are you going to do now? So through ingenuity, through technological advancements like these new cannons, through overwhelming force, Mehmet and the Ottoman Turks do indeed take the city of Constantinople in 1453. Giving to Mehmet the historical name of the Conqueror. The great prize, the last great city of Christendom in the East has been taken. Symbolically, the great church of that city of Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia, or the Hagia Sophia, is now a mosque. With 4 of the classic minaret towers there for the calls to prayer. And subsequent sultans can then turn their attention solely on advancing the boundary of their control further and further into Central Europe, eventually as far away as Austria. A little bit of an aside first. One of the things about Southeastern Europe at that time, once Byzantium had disintegrated, it was kind of like we talked about Germany before, it's fractured, You have some places that might be more or less ruled over uniformly by one king. But otherwise, there would be, this prince controls these lands and this prince controls these lands. And maybe he pays homage to the king of whatever, but maybe not. And so it was that the territory known as Wallachia, up here, and where just beyond Bulgaria, where Romania is, the prince there of Wallachia is Vlad Sepish. He was in league with the kings of the Hungarians, but his land is not considered nominally to be part of the Hungarian kingdom. So again, these kind of diffuse relationships. He, though, is on the front line of Ottoman advancement. And it's sort of up to him to take the forces under his control and stand in defense of his territories, with or without the support of Hungarian forces or anybody else. And boy, does he do it with gusto. Vlad, even in his own time, independent of any taking on of the Ottomans, and even vis-a-vis his own people, was known to be a pretty brutal cat. He's got the stereotypical torture chamber at the bottom of his castle, right? Pretty ruthless when it comes to exerting his control over his own people. But he has an army loyal to him, and he is going to stand up to the Ottoman. Now, the Ottomans offer him, look, if you just pay us taxes, and, your forces can serve in our Ottoman forces, or, you can just pay more taxes and avoid even that, there won't be any problems here. You won't have to deal with our big, badass, powerful army. But Vlad doesn't do that. Vlad had a history with the Ottomans, been taken prisoner as a little boy. His brother, remarkably, stayed behind, but Vlad escapes and decides he ain't never going back. And at one point, the Ottomans send emissaries to try to reason with this guy. And they come into his castle with their turbans on, and he asks them to take them off because that's custom, right? And they won't do it because that's their custom, right? So he has his guys hammer and nail the turbans onto their heads and send them back to the Sultan. It's the kind of thing that Vlad would do. There are some skirmishes between the two armies, and at one point it becomes clear there's going to be a major battle. You know, if they want Wallachia, they're going to have to fight the forces of Vlad Tepes, and there's going to be a major battle. And so the Sultan sets out at the front of the Ottoman force and heads for Wallachia. As they get close, and they start to notice a horrible stench. As they get closer, it gets worse and worse, and it's clear at this point it is the stench of death. And maybe not just a death, but like mass death. And then the Ottoman force finally comes upon what had been a town, but has been emptied of its people, and now is simply what is described as a forest of the impaled. And mentioned one of Vlad's nicknames, Vlad the Impaler. His preferred method of torture and death was to impale people on a stake. Often a wooden stake sharpened on one end, often burning such that it would cauterize the wound when it goes through your body so that you don't bleed to death and you instead die a very, very slow and painful death. And note that you could be impaled in any sort of manner, through the chest, through the backside, through orifices, through the side. And if you came upon someone who had been impaled recently, they would probably be in that process of dying that slow and very, very horrible death. And if you are the Ottoman army coming upon this forest of God knows how many, the historians don't have an exact number because in legendary tales later over the years it gets inflated. So you cannot possibly believe that there are like literally tens of thousands, but it was sure as hell more than just a few, right? You've got people who are in various stages of death or dying, from just having been impaled to been dead for a while. You can imagine how gruesome and literally horrifying such a sight might be. The stories vary as to what Mehmet's reaction was to this. Some people say that he was so mortified that they literally turned around and just went back. And then only later decided, okay, no, we can't let this guy just scare us away. We got to go fight this guy. Other people say that he comes upon it and he's like, huh. And he's more thoughtful about it. And he's like, man, you know, I really respect the guy who is so maniacal and so committed to, you know, controlling and maintaining control of his lands that he would do something this fucking crazy. Like, I have respect for that guy. So probably somewhere in between was the actual reaction of the Ottoman Sultan. In any case, they do regroup. They do eventually go to battle with Vlad's forces. He is eventually found and captured and killed and decapitated and his head put on a stake. This is what happens when you don't listen to and reason with the Ottomans. So what is the point of this whole aside? Well, partly it is the Ottomans can use the fact that there is no one central power, Christian power there to take on. They can take on this little prince and then focus on Hungary. And they can take on this other little prince and then go focus on Serbia. And then they can go and finally focus their attention on the Habsburg rulers of Austria, which is the extent of where they get. The other point is this guy becomes legendary. Woodcuts like this that show him eating supper in the forest of the impaled before the Ottomans came. Tales of the horrible torture and the things that he did to his people. You know, force-feeding babies to their mothers and these sorts of atrocities. They become especially popular in Germany in later years, and they're passed down until eventually a British novelist named Bram Stoker writes a legend and thinks, well, what if we took this idea of Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Tepes, and we made it like a supernatural thing, like he was actually, a vampire. So Vlad's family name was Dracul. His name and family name were Vlad Dracula. And so the legend of the very real historical character in the hands of Bram Stoker, given a supernatural element, becomes the legend of Dracula. That little aside opened up a few other avenues of pursuit. When the Ottomans took Christian realms like that, like when they would take a place like Wallachia under their control, which by the way was right next to Transylvania, which is also part of the Dracula legend. But when they took a place like Wallachia or Transylvania, they didn't force everybody there to convert to Islam. In fact, their practice, and long the practice in the Muslim empirical realms, was to consider Christians and Jews as dhimmis, or people of the book, meaning we all have the same foundational religious text going back from the Torah and through the Old Testament and now the Quran. So you people are wrong in the religion you follow, but at least you are sort of on the right track. And what we'll do, as long as you pay your taxes, will allow you to continue to practice your faith. Just kind of stay where you are and don't get in the way. But also, if you were among these new people that are conquered in southeastern Europe, Christian families were also forced to pay what they call the blood tax, the devshirme, the devshirme system. The blood tax means you have to give over to the Ottoman state your firstborn son. These firstborn sons are then taken to the palace of the Sultan. And I know after talking about Vlad Tepes, you guys are thinking, oh my God, what are they going to do to these poor children? They are then given probably the best education in the world. They are raised up in the Islamic faith. They are taught to love and be loved by the Sultan above all. They are trained up physically. And when they come of age, they are not only these devout Muslims who hold the Sultan dear to their heart, closer in their heart than anyone and anything, long having forgotten about their Christian families they don't even remember anything about anymore. But they are then separated into two groups. And the really smart ones get the top positions in the Ottoman government. They staff the Ottoman bureaucracy. And the ones that are maybe not so smart, but they're really strong, or they're really adept at, say, gunpowder weapons, they become the Janissary Corps of the Ottoman army. They become the elite soldiers of the Ottoman army. The Janissary Corps. The Ottomans had at that time probably the most elite army on earth. They are the first army to systematically use gunpowder weapons. In all previous armies, foot soldiers carried pikes, lances, swords, of course. You had horseback soldiers who were archers in the great nomadic armies from Central Asia over time. Foot soldiers in the Ottoman army, specifically the Janissary Corps, they carry guns. They carry gunpowder weapons, early muskets. Look at what they're wearing, too. The Ottoman army is the first army in world history to go into battle wearing uniforms. They're the first to go into battle accompanied by a military band. And imagine such a sight. Particularly when, also remember, these are the people who mastered gunpowder weapons, not just in those muskets in the hand of the Janissary Corps warriors, but also heavy, heavy cannon would accompany the Ottoman armies as well. And consider why they're waging war. And when they wage war on some other kingdom or some other prince and take his lands, In their minds, that's part of the jihad. That's part of the struggle to spread the Muslim faith. They consider themselves, as did the early followers of Osman Bey, to be Ghazis, warriors of the faith. And those are the warriors that the Sultan Suleiman has at his disposal as he treks in deep into Central Europe, not just Southeastern Europe. By the time of Suleiman, Ottoman armies have advanced into Austria and are eyeing the great prize of Vienna. This would have shaken Europe to its core if Vienna had fallen. I don't want to get too much into Suleiman because I think I have a schedule to watch a film that's going to go over, you can confirm that, that's going to go over a lot of what I just did, but really dive deep into the story of Suleiman. Is that right? Yeah. And that is on Thursday?
That is, well, it's not on a date. It's just
okay, good. All right. Well, that'll be Thursday. So I'll leave the film then to give Suleiman's sort of personal story.
But the link doesn't work on the syllabus.
I'll fix that.
All right.
You know, on YouTube, things get taken down,
yeah.
put back up. And so, Suleiman the Magnificent, obviously with a name like that, given to him by history, he is no slouch. He expanded Ottoman realms further than any other sultan. He oversaw great building projects with his favored architect that they'll talk about in the film, who builds a number of mosques and palaces, and many of which stand to this day. He was a poet. Sultans back then, it wasn't enough to just be the great warrior sultan and be the caliph and defender of the faith. And you needed a trade. And he was a great poet. Wrote beautiful poetry. If you can read their version of Turco-Arabic. Even in translation, it's good. But man, he has an incredible life story. I said I wouldn't get into it, but your wife betrays you, the love of your life, you have to kill one of your sons, these kinds of things. You have to deal with not only your offensive war that you're waging against Europe, but also to your east, war with the Safavids, war with Muslims of another stripe, if you will. And all of this to say, I guess for now, that Suleiman is not successful in taking Vienna. Perhaps by just accident of timing and logistics. There were really, really bad rains when they went on that campaign. And the big cannons, the big guns that they take for siege warfare got bogged down and they had to leave them behind. And so, unlike with the fall of a city like Constantinople, where you had the full maximum use of your big siege guns, they arrive at Vienna without those capabilities. Questions? By 1600, the Ottomans had conquered most of the Arab world and a substantial part of Christian Europe, but the empire begins to enter a long period of decline around the mid-1600s. When you have a state that's geared towards militaristic expansion, what happens when you reach the limits of that expansion? What happens when you can no longer expand? When you run out of people to conquer? When there's no new wealth to be gained in those conquests, no new people to tax to fund your military campaigns and to fund your ever-expanding bureaucracy. What if the subsequent sultans after great ones like Mehmet and Suleiman, what if they're not so great? What if they lack power even in the palace? What if they're susceptible to palace intrigues? What happens when they're not a great warrior sultan that's out there leading the army successfully on the field of battle? And over time, it's what they call viziers or top-level bureaucrats in the Ottoman state who become more powerful than the sultan himself. What if you have top leaders in the Janissary Corps that become more powerful than the sultan himself? What happens if you end up with a meritocrat, or what had been a meritocratic class of leaders becomes a hereditary caste system. Initially, the Ottoman bureaucracy was supposed to be a meritocracy. That is, the people who were best to do one job are the ones that are given that job. What if you drift away from that and towards you get the job you get because of who you are? That is typically a less effective and certainly less efficient system over time. And then, likely story, you begin to see rampant corruption in the bureaucracy, people pilfering the limited revenues for themselves, like everybody, taking a little when nobody's looking. And the later sultans of this era are essentially living in the palace like profligates, that is, living with food and drink and women of the harem and living a lavish lifestyle afforded to their position and not so much concerned with the health of the Ottoman state, if that makes sense, or concerned perhaps even with the intrigues going on around them. Consider too, the Ottoman armies up to this point were unrivaled on land. Problem is the Ottomans never matched that with a powerful navy. And in the 1600s, they have some significant losses on the high seas, notably to Europeans. Think about what the Portuguese had been doing in the 1500s, sailing around Africa so they could get into the Indian Ocean. And they established contacts with India, right? Well, whose backyard is that? If you go up the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, this is the Ottoman realms right here, yeah? So there's going to be a showdown. And it's the Portuguese who defeat the Ottoman Navy there in the Indian Ocean, such that the Portuguese have full run of the Indian Ocean to do whatever they please. And then two, in the Mediterranean, this would be sort of the front yard of the Ottoman Empire, right? Here or here. There's a major battle at Lepanto. Do I have that up there? I do not. Major naval battle that pits the Ottoman Navy against a coalition of Christian European powers, and the Ottomans lose that as well. So they become essentially landlocked. They lack control of the oceans either to their south and east or to their north and west. And it's Europeans who have free reign of those seas. Consider this too. What were the Portuguese doing over there in India, China, the Spice Islands, and eventually the Dutch and the Spanish and others? They're trying to tap in and get direct access to trade. Remember, that was the whole motivation for the Portuguese going around Africa. Whole motivation for Columbus sailing west. So what has effectively happened by the 1600s then that would also be damaging to the Ottoman Empire? Well, okay, let me ask it this way. Why did Europeans want to establish those direct connections as opposed to the existing, like, say, Silk Road routes?
Taxes.
Because it was all the stuff was passing through the Ottoman Empire and getting taxed. So what happens now? The Ottomans have been cut out of that trade. Hardly any of that stuff needs to go through the old Silkland routes and go through places like Baghdad anymore. Europeans have cut them out, and so they're losing revenue because they no longer have that vital spot between the West and the East. Europeans have made that moot. Does that make sense?
It's like buying from China, directly from China.
Right. Exactly. And then finally, and you're going to see this pretty much everywhere, silver flowing in from the Americas, from where the Spanish were mining and forcing the Indians into mines and enriching themselves, but then using that money to buy things from others and who might then themselves, or maybe the Spanish themselves, yes, buy things from the Ottomans. But all of that silver flowing in eventually, the economists tell us, causes inflation. And that does not help either. Oops. So they move east to the Safavid Empire, where Iran is today, Persia. Similarities. The Safavids are also a horseback riding, semi-nomadic, warlike peoples from the Central Asian steppe, just like the Ottomans were. Similarity, they ride south into the lands of Persia in the aftermath of Mongol rule and establish themselves as the rulers and convert to Islam. So with those facts, the story is identical to that of the Ottomans, except that we're looking at the lands east of the Tigris and Euphrates and west of the Indus River in India. Here's a major difference. When the Safavids convert to Islam, they do not convert to the traditional Sunni version of Islam. They convert to the Shia or Shiite version of Islam. And this is no small difference. And it dates all the way back to the death of Muhammad. When Muhammad dies, there was dispute as to who should become the next caliph or defender of the faith, right? And some people believed that in the tradition of Muhammad, and in the true wishes of Muhammad, and the Sunnah, if you will, that the person who should become the next caliph ought to be, an immediate family member of Muhammad. Some disagreed and said no, Muhammad had tapped Ali to be the next caliph. And they, the Shia Ali, or the party of Ali, believe it should have been him. Many of those people end up being murdered. And for subsequent followers, that martyrdom of their dying for who should have been the one true caliph to follow Muhammad, that martyrdom becomes a part of their belief system. And the differences between the two only harden over time. Initially, it was everything to do with this succession dispute, but over time, the two forms of Islam take on different elements, different characteristics that only fuel a profound, I'm not going to say hatred. They have profound differences that develop over time beyond the succession dispute and the martyrdom. Sunnis would hold fast to traditions more so than Shia, who were more open to using like icons and iconography that some Sunnis would consider to be blasphemous. Just for example, Shiites can revere and follow, one specific cleric and his teachings, which the Sunni would find is to be inappropriate. But for our purposes here today, suffice to say that the Safavid Empire is a Shiite empire, the Ottoman Empire is a Sunni Muslim empire, and those two, for those reasons, and also just reasons of competition, as two empires that consider themselves the great Muslim empire, sharing a border, having disputes over that border, are going to go to war over that border. And so in the time of Suleiman himself, while he wants to be focused on taking Vienna, he has to deal with the Safavids over here. So the Ottoman army was very often split between its eastern and western borders. Perpetual conflict. Safavid art and architecture is really something to behold. I believe this is from a mosque in Isfahan, which is right there. I won't particularly time constraints, I won't Google Earth you, even though I really want to. But in terms of Safavid decline, it's the same story. You have warfare with the Ottomans that is sapping the coffers, costing you a lot of money, in other words. You have succession struggles, inept rulers, the rise of militant groups within your own realms, bouts over intolerance within the religion, and so on. And all of that to say, if we look at the Ottomans, the Safavids, and then in just a second the Mughals, for these variety of very common reasons and more, they're all going to be entering a period of decline at exactly the wrong time. When it comes to they're having to deal with this issue of Europeans rising up, building these maritime empires, building bigger and better navies, consolidating the control of the high seas, and so on. So we move east of the Indus River into the Ganges and much of the Deccan Plateau here, and on up to the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas. It is the Mughals who consolidate power in this area around the same time of the Ottomans and the Safavids to their west. Similarities, broken record. Semi-nomadic, horseback riding, warrior people from the Central Asian steppe move into this area. I guess one difference is the Mongols never did take full control of India, so there wasn't a Mongol vacuum, but there certainly was no powerful Indian state at that time to take down as a singular conquest. You just had to establish yourself, consolidate control, and build a state. And that they did. And their leaders are Muslim. What's different here, as opposed to, say, where the Persians are Muslim, the Arabs that the Ottomans rule over are Muslim, India has not only a lot of Muslims, but also a lot of Hindus. And Hinduism is a religion completely apart from the Abrahamic religions. It has essentially no commonalities with those monotheistic religions. It is polytheistic, many gods. And Hindus believe in the wheel of life and reincarnation, and the concepts of dharma and karma. If you follow your dharma for what is your role in life, for me, am I a good teacher? Do I follow the way of a good teacher? If I do, maybe my karma should be good, and maybe I'll come back in the next life as something other than a school teacher. If I'm a really terrible teacher and a bad person, I might come back so far down the chain of being, I might not even come back as a lowly street sweeper, right? I could come back as, a cockroach or something. I'm being a little ridiculous, but this is how it works. All of that to say, anyone who is going to rule effectively over India has to do some reconciliation work. You have a continent full of people who are not all followers of the one same religion. There has to be some way of tolerance, and it wasn't always the case, depending on who was in power in the Mughal realms. It wasn't always the case that everyone would be tolerated and get along. For example, under great ruler Akbar, there is widespread tolerance for Hindus, and they can go to Hindu festivals and practice their Hindu faith as they see fit, and conduct Hindu rituals and so on. Build Hindu temples. But if you have an intolerant ruler like Aurangzeb, who attempts to reverse all of that and ban the building of Hindu temples and ban Hindu religious festivals and encourage the persecution of Hindus, and not only Hindus, but the third religious tradition of the Indian subcontinent, Sikhs, or Sikhism, which is somewhat of an amalgam of those two religions. You're not going to allow Sikhs to wear the traditional turban that they must wear at all times. That height of that kind of intolerance, your country's going to be destabilized. And that's what happens under a ruler like Aurangzeb. I guess the point here is when you move from a great ruler like Akbar to someone like Aurangzeb, that is what's going to contribute to the decline of your empire. It's one of the truisms of Indian history, the history of the subcontinent, is once you have these two religions, you have to reconcile them in some meaningful way, or the only other alternative is to have two separate countries, which is what we have today. We'll get there. We'll get to that in a few weeks. Taj Mahal, why do I have that here? This was built during a time where you can see in the Taj Mahal itself the melding of cultures, of Muslim and Hindu cultures. You didn't know what Taj Mahal is. It's not a mosque, even though it has the 4 minaret towers that would be characteristic of Muslim architecture throughout the Muslim world. It's a mausoleum. I thought about this the other day when I just turned on CNN. It happened to be some program on the Windsor dynasty, and they were talking about Princess Diana. And I'm so old, I remember when she died and how terrible that was. And I remember a little bit less about the intrigues of her and Charles's love affairs. I was too young to know anything about that stuff. But it showed at one point, apparently she and her husband, Prince Charles, were cheating on each other, and they were never together. And it showed this picture of her sitting alone on a bench, the only person out there sitting alone on a bench, kind of looking lonely in front of the Taj Mahal. And the commentator said, well, think about the power of this image. This is a mausoleum that Shah Jahan built for his favorite wife. So you have a lonely woman whose husband is cheating on her, sitting alone in front of something this great that someone would build, and you have to set aside favorite wife, like had multiple wives. But if you just consider this is something so beautiful and great that this Shah would build for his late wife, that image was thought to be powerful at that time. But of course, this is not about Princess Diana. This combines that sort of mosque-style architecture with the dome and the 4 minarets with really ornate marble, intricate design cut into that marble, the white marble reflecting pool, the intricacy and ornateness that would be indicative of Hindu art and architecture, along with that sort of form of the traditional Muslim mosque. So, in terms of summary, you have seen then 3 Central Asian Turkic peoples move south and establish themselves and build powerful Muslim empires in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in between. In the wake of the Mongols' destruction, each of those 3 states was aggressively expansionist and sought to spread Islam through holy war. They made war upon one another in the process. Each, of course, made use of gunpowder weapons. I told you they were sometimes referred to as the gunpowder empires, muskets and cannons. But they didn't go far enough. They didn't continue to refine their technology. They didn't continue to make use of bigger or better weapons. They became, in essence, too conservative, too resistant to change. While at the same time, Europeans who are constantly having to fight to stay ahead of one another, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, the English, the French, that constant competition and warfare between them means they must innovate or die. And when they say innovate, they're not just talking about refining their armies. They're sailing all over the world and refining their naval technology too. And they're figuring out how to build better ships of war, how to consolidate their control not over a land-based empire, but over a maritime, seaborne empire that connects different parts of the world from the Indian Ocean to the New World. Which, by the way, they are finding in the New World the wealth that can fuel all of this. Which, if you're one of these landlocked gunpowder weapons, you do not have that influx of wealth. Finally, I think these three empires in question here didn't take Europe seriously. Why would anybody at that time? People had in other parts of the old world had a centuries-old contempt for Europe. They associated Europe with the backwardness of the Dark Ages. And so while Europe is making bigger, better weapons, stronger navies, expanding into the New World, making connections in the East, these Muslim empires are going to get left behind. Questions? I forgot that I had an excerpt here of a Greek historian, no doubt employed by the Ottoman state after they conquered Greece, talking about when Mehmet's army comes upon what Vlad had done, Vlad Tepes. The Sultan's army entered into the area of the impalements, which was 17 stads long and 7 stads wide. There were large stakes there on which, as it was said, about 20,000 men, women, and children had been spitted. Quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said that it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who does such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people. He said that a man who had done such things was worth much. The rest of the Turks were dumbfounded when they saw the multitude of men on the stakes. There were infants, too, affixed to their mothers on the stakes, and birds had made nests in their entrails. Have a nice day. Oh, I forgot, too. Vlad was such an animal. It's not just he was like an animal and terrible to his people. Like, he was reckless abandon with his own self. He literally rides at night, like disguises himself, and rides into the Ottoman army's camp himself to try to just go and find the tent of the Sultan and just murder him. And the only reason he didn't is he picked the wrong tent. But imagine a man so crazy that he's willing to ride at night into the encampment of the most powerful army in the world. Such was Vlad Tepes, I guess.